Welcome back. We're starting a new series, and as we get started in that new series, I want to take something from our last series. In the very first video in our last series, or the second video, the primary way God leads us is by impressing things on our heart, and our job is to pull that out with our head. One thing I didn't clarify in that video, which I want to do now, is that one common way that manifests is by a song being impressed on our heart, or we finding ourselves singing a song. We weren't thinking about it. We don't know why the song started bubbling up in us, but we found ourselves singing it. That's one primary way God leads us. Although a lot of us dismiss that because it's not some high complex thing, because it's a very simple thing, we downplay it. But actually, it's one key way God leads us. And it's one key way for several reasons. Like I said, you need to pull the message out from your heart. But the song, when it comes in the form of a song, you don't need to pull it out. The message is kind of there in the song. You might just need to apply it from there on. It's much more than just an impression that you have to articulate what that impression is trying to say. It already articulates itself for you in the language of that song. What you then need to do is then apply it to your life. Okay, how is that applying to my life right now? And maybe I've never said this on this channel, but I need to say it now. There are three stages I think we should categorize our leading from the Lord into, whether it's a dream or an impression in your heart or a vision. There is the dream or the impression on your heart. That's one level. That's the substance level. I haven't taxonomized it prior to this video. There is that substance level of whether the dream or the vision or the impression or the voice. There is that level. There is the interpretation. And I want to emphasize that we should distinguish between the substance and the interpretation. If you collapse the interpretation with the substance, there is a danger, because sometimes you've not fully interpreted it or accurately interpreted it, but once you've collapsed that, then you've lost the original thing. You don't get to be able to interpret and get it correctly or get it more accurately. So learn to separate your dreams from the interpretation of your dreams. Learn to separate the impressions on your heart from your articulations of those impressions on your heart. Learn to separate the substance from the interpretation. So that's stage one and stage two, the substance and the interpretation. And then there's the third stage, which I call the application. It can apply separately. Let me give you a random example that comes to mind. I remember a friend of mine who was praying for another friend of ours. Our relationship had just gone bad. She had split up with the person she was with. And so this my friend of mine was praying for that other friend. And in her dreams, she saw this friend of hers giving a Bible to the person she was with up until that point. And so when my friend came out of the dream, our conclusion is that they were ultimately going to get married. Now, 10 years later, they didn't get married, and so she certainly didn't get that dream interpreted right. But I knew from the very get-go that she was getting ahead of herself in interpretation and application. And take note of those two things I just said again. There is the interpretation and there's the application. And I just want to use that as an example of showing the different levels. So the interpretation level for her is that the guy's deliverance is in the hands of that affair, the lady's relationship with him. So basically, she understood that the guy has some things he needs deliverance from, and it will come through that lady. Now that's interpretation. Then she then went on to apply it as then it will be in the context of marriage. So they need to get married for that deliverance to happen. Now you can see why I would like to separate that. For one thing, I never went with our interpretation that, because I usually don't like arguing with people about the substance, if it is from God or if it's not from God. Let's just assume that dream was from God. Let's just go with that. It's one thing to say that meant that his deliverance is with her. I think it could mean a couple of other things besides that. But that was how she understood it, that his deliverance lied with that lady. But if you do go with that, the one that I could clearly argue against, which I did argue with her, is that why does this need to be in the context of marriage? Why do they have to get married for him to get his deliverance from her? Why do they need to get married? It could happen through other relationships. They could remain friends and his deliverance could still come through her, through their friendship. But she was just convinced that it was in the context of marriage, and I realized it was a desire that she didn't want them to split up, and she was just jumping ahead of herself and concluding that they were going to get married. Right now, they aren't married. The lady is married to somebody else. So there is something there again. I'm trying to show us there is a difference between the substance and the interpretation, and there's a difference between the interpretation and the application. But that's not the focus of this video. Again, what I'm saying is that one common way that the impression of our heart manifests is by a song bubbling up in our heart that we cannot trace what we were thinking that made that song come up. It just began to spring up from within. It's a common way in which God impresses a message on our heart, and it's a very good one because the articulation of the message is already there. You don't need to articulate it. It just brings its own articulation already. What you then need to do is not articulate or interpret, but to apply it. That's what you need to do. And why did I say all that? One of the primary ways, one good way that we need to understand God, one good way we can understand God is through what I call the heart. Many of us, we've become too rational. I'm a very rational person, as you can tell, but we've overemphasized the role of rationality to the exclusion of the arts, not the romantic, but the heart. Let me leave it at that. Music, obvious, is an art. So you can see where I'm going. One of the primary ways God impresses a message in our heart is by impressing our hearts with a song, music, which is an art. And again, I'm saying that art is one big way to know God. Why? Because it takes us much longer to rationally pull together what God is communicating to us. If you want to rationally lay it out and get the full sense of it, it takes much longer. But the arts help us to hold on to it and capture it all at once. Music and poetry can help us capture immediately what God is trying to communicate to us. And then after the fact of the music or the poetry, we can then begin to think into that poetry and see the full scope of everything that needs to be said. But music can capture it. Arts can capture many things that God wants to say to us. Art is one primary way that we should seek when we want to capture a lot of the things of the spirit. The spirit lend themselves much more to poetry, to music, than they do to rationality. Again, we've established it, the spirit is not opposed to rationality, but many of us who have then chosen to bring in our rationality in our work with God, we are always in danger of overemphasizing rationality and downplaying the heart. But I'm bringing back on board today that yes, the spirit uses the arts a lot, uses music, uses poetry. As a matter of fact, uses dance, but we won't get into that today. From the next video, we'll get into using poetry to talk about God. God bless.